He was the wisest king to ever walk the earth, a man chosen by God, blessed with riches, power, and wisdom beyond compare. His reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and the construction of a temple that would stand for centuries. But behind the scenes of King Solomon's glorious empire, a darker story was unfolding. In his final days, the man who had everything began to lose the one thing that mattered most: his heart. How did the king who built the temple for the God of Israel end up bowing to foreign idols? What drove Solomon, the wisest of kings, to betray the very God who made him great? And what were the devastating consequences for the kingdom he ruled? Was it greed, ambition, or the influence of his many wives that led to Solomon's tragic fall? Could it have been prevented? And what lessons does his story hold for us today? Join us as we uncover the final, heartbreaking chapter in the life of King Solomon, the rise and fall of the wisest king to ever live. Before we dive into the fall of King Solomon, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our deep dives into the hidden stories of history's greatest figures. If you find this story as fascinating as we do, give this video a thumbs up and share it with those who love uncovering the truth behind ancient mysteries. Now, let's step back into ancient Israel to the final days of the king who had everything, but lost it all. In the annals of history, few names are as revered for wisdom and grandeur as King Solomon, the son of David. His reign, marked by prosperity, peace, and unparalleled splendor, was the golden age of Israel. Solomon's wisdom, granted to him by God in response to his humble request, made him the most sought-after ruler in the ancient world. Kings, queens, and scholars from distant lands journeyed to witness the depth of his knowledge and to behold the wealth of his kingdom. At the height of his reign, Solomon's wisdom knew no bounds. His ability to render just judgments, such as the famous case of the two women claiming the same child, left even the most cynical onlookers in awe. His proverbs and songs, numbering in the thousands, revealed a deep understanding of the human condition and the natural world. He spoke of the cedar trees of Lebanon and the hyssop growing from the wall, of beasts and birds, of fish and creeping things. Yet, Solomon's greatest achievement was the building of the temple in Jerusalem, a house for the name of the Lord, where the Ark of the Covenant would reside. For 7 years, laborers worked tirelessly to complete this magnificent structure. The temple's splendor was unrivaled, a symbol of the nation's devotion to God and the crowning glory of Solomon's reign. The dedication of the temple was a momentous occasion, with Solomon praying before the people, asking God to dwell among them and bless the generations to come. The early years of Solomon's reign were marked by peace and prosperity, as his wisdom brought stability and justice to the land. But as time passed, the seeds of a tragic downfall began to take root, a downfall that would forever stain the legacy of the wisest king. As Solomon's wisdom became known far and wide, his fame spread across the nations. His wisdom was not merely intellectual, it was practical, guiding him in governance, diplomacy, and even economics. Under his rule, Israel experienced unprecedented prosperity. The land flourished, its borders were secure, and its people enjoyed the benefits of a stable and just ruler. One of the most celebrated moments of Solomon's reign was the visit of the Queen of Sheba, a powerful monarch from a distant land. She had heard of Solomon's extraordinary wisdom and came with gifts of gold, spices, and precious stones to test him with hard questions. Solomon answered all her questions, and not a single one was too difficult for him. Astonished by his wisdom and the grandeur of his palace, the queen proclaimed, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes." Solomon's diplomatic prowess was as impressive as his wisdom. His alliances with neighboring nations, often solidified through marriages to foreign princesses, brought peace and trade agreements that enriched Israel. Ships from distant lands brought gold, silver, ivory, and rare animals, and Jerusalem became the center of commerce and culture in the ancient Near East. The scale of Solomon's projects was immense. Beyond the temple, he built palaces, fortified cities, and a great fleet of ships. His construction of the port at Ezion-Geber allowed Israel to control key trade routes, making the kingdom a major player in international commerce. The wealth generated by these enterprises was extraordinary, with silver becoming so common in Jerusalem that it was said to be as plentiful as stones. Yet, with all his wealth and wisdom, there were warning signs that Solomon was straying from the path of his early devotion. His growing harem of foreign wives brought foreign gods with them, and Solomon, in his desire to maintain peace and keep his alliances strong, began to make compromises. Small at first, these compromises would lead to much larger failures. Solomon's rise to greatness was swift and spectacular, But as his kingdom expanded and his influence grew, so did the seeds of disobedience and division. What had begun as the most glorious reign in Israel's history was now inching toward an inevitable decline. Unbeknownst to Solomon, the latter part of his reign would be marked by spiritual failure and the consequences of choices made in the name of diplomacy and political gain. For all his wisdom, Solomon could not escape the gradual erosion of his heart. The turning point in his life came not through war or external pressure, but through subtle, internal compromise. The same wisdom that had guided him to greatness now began to serve his desires, rather than God's will. The alliances he forged through marriage to foreign princesses, a strategy that initially brought peace and prosperity, became the source of his greatest downfall. As Solomon's influence grew, so did the number of his wives. Over time, these marriages, which were supposed to be political maneuvers, became spiritual snares. Solomon's heart, once fully devoted to the God of Israel, began to drift. The foreign wives brought with them their gods, Ashtoreth, Milcom, Chemosh, and Molech, each worshipped through pagan rituals that were an abomination in the eyes of God. At first, Solomon tolerated these practices in the name of diplomacy. But soon, tolerance turned into acceptance and acceptance into participation. High places were erected for these foreign gods on the hills around Jerusalem, and Solomon himself began to offer sacrifices to them. The man who had once prayed for wisdom to lead God's people now bowed before idols, his heart divided between loyalty to the God of his fathers and the demands of his foreign wives. The Bible records this shift with a note of sorrow. Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. Though Solomon had built the temple, the very house of God, he had also built altars to false gods, a betrayal that would have lasting consequences for his kingdom. God, who had appeared to Solomon twice and blessed him beyond measure, was deeply grieved by Solomon's disobedience. The warnings were clear. Solomon's covenant with God required faithfulness, not just in public works but in private devotion. Yet Solomon's heart had grown distant, and his once close relationship with God was now clouded by his compromises. God sent a message of judgment to Solomon, telling him that because he had turned away from the Lord and worshipped other gods, the kingdom would be torn from his hands. However, out of respect for David, Solomon's father, God promised that this punishment would not happen during Solomon's lifetime, but would fall on his son. The once great kingdom, united and prosperous, would be divided, and Israel would never be the same again. This turning point marked the beginning of the end for Solomon. Though he remained on the throne, his power began to wane, and his legacy, once assured, now stood on fragile ground. Solomon, the wisest man who had ever lived, had allowed his heart to wander, and in doing so, he set the stage for the unraveling of all that he had built. The seeds of his downfall had been planted, and the consequences would soon follow. As Solomon's heart drifted further from God, the consequences of his compromises began to manifest. What had once been a peaceful and prosperous reign became riddled with unrest and discontent. The splendor of Solomon's court could no longer hide the cracks that were forming beneath the surface of his kingdom. One of the most immediate consequences of Solomon's divided heart was the oppression of his own people. To maintain his lavish lifestyle, fund his extensive building projects, and uphold his vast network of alliances, Solomon placed heavy taxes on the people of Israel. The burden of these taxes, combined with the forced labor required for his construction projects, began to weigh heavily on the population. Though Israel was wealthy, the common people were struggling under the weight of Solomon's ambition. What had begun as a wise and just reign was now becoming a burden for many. The people's dissatisfaction was growing, and it did not go unnoticed. Among those discontented was Jeroboam, a capable and ambitious man from the tribe of Ephraim. Jeroboam had risen through the ranks to become one of Solomon's trusted officials, overseeing the labor force of the northern tribes. But as he saw the suffering of the people, he began to question Solomon's leadership. It was not long before Jeroboam's discontent turned into open rebellion. In a divine twist of fate, God sent the prophet Ahijah to Jeroboam with a message. Meeting him on the road, Ahijah took off his new cloak, tore it into 12 pieces, and handed 10 of them to Jeroboam. "Take 10 pieces for yourself," the prophet said, "for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David, I will leave 1 tribe for Solomon's son, so that David's line will continue to rule in Jerusalem." This was a powerful moment, signaling the inevitable division of the kingdom. God had decreed that Solomon's unfaithfulness would result in the fracturing of the united Israel. Jeroboam, once a servant of Solomon, was now marked as the future king of the northern tribes. Solomon, sensing the threat, sought to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam fled to Egypt, awaiting the day when God's judgment on Solomon's house would be fulfilled. Meanwhile, external enemies that had long been subdued under Solomon's reign began to rise up against him. Hadad the Edomite, a thorn in David's side, returned from exile and began to stir rebellion in the south. Rezin, another adversary, established his rule over Damascus and harassed Solomon from the north. These external pressures, combined with internal strife, weakened the once mighty kingdom. Solomon, who had been blessed with peace from all sides in the early years of his reign, now faced adversaries both within and outside his borders. The consequences of his spiritual compromises were playing out in the political and social landscape of Israel. The kingdom, once united under his wise rule, was now divided by discontent and rebellion. As the weight of his choices bore down on him, Solomon found himself further distanced from the God who had once walked so closely with him. The consequences of his actions were no longer just future promises, they were becoming his present reality. Though he remained on the throne, the kingdom was slipping through his fingers, and the legacy he had hoped to leave was being tarnished by the very decisions he had made in pursuit of power, wealth, and pleasure. Solomon's wisdom had brought him to the heights of glory, but his compromises were leading him to the depths of sorrow. The once great king now faced the full weight of his disobedience, and the kingdom he had built was beginning to crumble. Despite Solomon's continued reign, the divine judgment pronounced over his kingdom loomed ever closer. The warnings that had been delivered to him, first by God himself and then through the prophet Ahijah to Jeroboam, were now beginning to unfold. The grandeur of Solomon's earlier years, once a shining example of God's blessing, had turned into a shadow of what could have been. The spiritual decay that had taken root in his heart was reflected in the slow unraveling of his kingdom. God, in his mercy, had decided that Solomon would not live to see the full extent of his judgment. Yet the consequences of his actions were already taking shape, preparing the way for a divided nation after his death. The promise given to David, of a descendant on the throne, remained intact, but it would be heavily diminished. One tribe would remain loyal to Solomon's descendants, while the other 10 tribes would break away, marking the end of the united Israel that David had established and Solomon had inherited. As Solomon grew older, adversaries that had been subdued during his reign re-emerged with new strength. One such enemy was Hadad the Edomite, a member of the royal house of Edom who had escaped David's conquests and taken refuge in Egypt. Now, with the support of Pharaoh, Hadad sought to reclaim his people's independence and harassed Israel from the south, making constant raids and threatening the stability of Solomon's borders. Rezin, a former servant of the king of Zobah, also became a thorn in Solomon's side. After establishing himself as the king of Aram in Damascus, Rezin made relentless attacks on Israel's northern territories. These external threats chipped away at Solomon's once impenetrable kingdom, and where once there had been peace on all sides, now there was unrest and conflict. But the greatest threat to Solomon's house did not come from foreign nations, it came from within. Jeroboam, who had received the prophecy from Ahijah, became the symbol of the kingdom's impending fracture. Though he had fled to Egypt to escape Solomon's wrath, Jeroboam's return was inevitable. He waited, biding his time, knowing that once Solomon was gone, the opportunity to claim the 10 tribes would present itself. God's judgment was clear. Because Solomon had abandoned the covenant and followed after other gods, the kingdom would be torn from his son's hands. But out of love for David, God would not remove the entire kingdom. The tribe of Judah, along with Benjamin, would remain under the rule of Solomon's lineage, centered in Jerusalem, the city where David had established his throne and where the temple stood as a reminder of Israel's covenant with God. Yet, this partial preservation was not a sign of approval but of grace. The division of the kingdom was a direct result of Solomon's choices. His idolatry had set in motion a chain of events that would not be stopped, and his reign, once seen as the height of Israel's glory, was now tainted by the consequences of his disobedience. As Solomon faced the end of his life, he must have reflected on the promises God had made to his father, David, and the way his own actions had jeopardized those promises. Though his wisdom was unparalleled, even Solomon could not escape the judgment of God. His kingdom would not pass to his descendants in the full strength that it had once held. Instead, his son would inherit a divided and weakened realm, a kingdom already broken in spirit and soon to be broken in form. The judgment was a sobering reminder that even the greatest among men could fall if they turned away from God. Solomon, whose wisdom had been his greatest gift, had ultimately failed in the most important aspect of his life, faithfulness to the God who had blessed him. And in that failure, the seeds of division and downfall had been sown. The United Kingdom of Israel, once a beacon of prosperity and peace, would never be the same again. As Solomon's life drew to a close, the weight of his choices began to settle heavily upon him. The king, once renowned for his wisdom and unparalleled achievements, now faced the sobering reality of his spiritual decline and the impending judgment on his house. In his final years, Solomon's heart seemed to reflect a deep sense of regret, which is echoed in the reflective and melancholic tone of the book of Ecclesiastes. In his earlier years, Solomon had pursued wisdom, wealth, and pleasure with unbridled ambition. He had built a magnificent temple, palaces, and cities, and had surrounded himself with unimaginable riches. He had tasted all that the world had to offer: luxury, knowledge, power, and influence. But as he grew older, Solomon realized that these pursuits, when removed from a life centered on God, were ultimately meaningless. In Ecclesiastes, the king who had everything declared, "Vanity of vanities. All is vanity." Solomon had come to see the futility of a life spent chasing earthly gain. His great wealth, his accomplishments, and his indulgences had left him feeling empty. The wisdom that had brought him so much fame now weighed heavily on him, as he recognized how far he had strayed from the God of his youth. He lamented the fleeting nature of life and the reality that death comes for everyone, whether wise or foolish, rich or poor. For all of his wisdom, Solomon could not escape the consequences of his spiritual compromises, and this realization haunted him in his final days. The sadness of Solomon's end was not just in his personal reflections, but also in the knowledge that his kingdom, once united and strong, was on the verge of collapse. He had built a legacy of greatness, but he had also planted the seeds of division and rebellion. The fractures within the nation were growing, and he knew that his son, Rehoboam, would inherit a kingdom on the brink of disintegration. When Solomon died, after reigning for 40 years, he was buried in the city of David, and the throne passed to Rehoboam. But the transition was anything but smooth. Almost immediately after Solomon's death, the cracks that had been forming in the kingdom during his later years became impossible to ignore. Jeroboam, the man whom Ahijah had prophesied would rule over the northern tribes, returned from his exile in Egypt, ready to seize the opportunity. The people, burdened by the heavy taxes and labor Solomon had imposed, demanded relief from Rehoboam. But Rehoboam, in a display of youthful arrogance and poor judgment, refused to ease their burdens. The result was catastrophic. The 10 northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, broke away and formed the northern kingdom of Israel, leaving only Judah and Benjamin under the rule of Solomon's line. The once united kingdom of Israel was now divided, just as God had foretold. The splendor and unity of Solomon's reign were shattered, and the divided kingdom would never again achieve the same level of greatness. From that point forward, Israel would be marked by conflict, rebellion, and, eventually, exile. Solomon's sad end serves as a profound warning. Despite all his wisdom, wealth, and power, his divided heart led to the unraveling of his kingdom and his legacy. He had begun his reign with such promise: a king who sought after God, who built a temple for his name, and who was blessed with wisdom unlike any other. But in the end, Solomon's unfaithfulness to God overshadowed his achievements. The life of Solomon, once a symbol of divine favor, ended as a tragic example of what happens when one turns away from God. The wisest king who ever lived failed in the most crucial aspect of his life, staying faithful to the God who had given him everything. His story serves as a reminder that no amount of wisdom, wealth, or power can compensate for a heart that is divided in its devotion. The life of King Solomon, with all its brilliance and tragedy, offers timeless lessons on the dangers of neglecting faith and the consequences of moral and spiritual compromise. Though Solomon's reign began as a dazzling testimony to God's favor, it ended as a cautionary tale of what happens when a person drifts away from the very source of their strength. One of the most striking lessons from Solomon's life is the importance of guarding the heart. Solomon was a man blessed with wisdom beyond measure, yet even he fell victim to the gradual erosion of his devotion to God. It wasn't an instant collapse but a slow, subtle decline. His marriages to foreign women, which began as political alliances, opened the door to idolatry. Solomon likely thought he could control the influence of his wives' foreign gods, but over time, their presence in his life led him astray. His heart, once wholly devoted to the God of Israel, became divided, and that division led to his downfall. The lesson here is clear. No matter how wise or accomplished a person may be, a divided heart is vulnerable. Solomon allowed his love for wealth, pleasure, and political alliances to overshadow his love for God. His story reminds us that spiritual decline often begins with small compromises that, if unchecked, grow into major failures. Another lesson is the fleeting nature of earthly success. Solomon had everything a king could dream of: wealth, power, wisdom, and fame. People from all over the world sought his counsel, and Israel flourished under his rule. Yet, despite his incredible success, Solomon's later reflections in Ecclesiastes reveal a man who realized the futility of his pursuits. "What does a man gain from all the toil at which he toils under the sun?" he asked. His grand palaces, his vast riches, and even his legendary wisdom, without a right relationship with God, were ultimately meaningless. Solomon's words remind us that no amount of worldly achievement can bring lasting fulfillment. Wealth, power, and pleasure are temporary, but a life grounded in faith and obedience to God has eternal significance. Solomon himself admitted that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and yet, he strayed from that foundational truth. His story teaches us that pursuing material gain or human accolades at the expense of spiritual devotion will always leave us empty. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of all is the lasting impact of our choices on those who follow. Solomon's unfaithfulness to God did not only affect him, it affected his descendants and the entire nation of Israel. Because of his disobedience, the kingdom was torn apart after his death, with the northern tribes breaking away to form a separate kingdom under Jeroboam. The division of Israel led to centuries of conflict, weakening the nation and making it vulnerable to foreign conquest and exile. Solomon's failure to remain faithful to God did not just cost him his legacy, it shaped the future of Israel for generations to come. His story reminds us that our choices have consequences that often reach far beyond our own lives. What we do, for good or ill, can set the course for those who come after us. In the end, Solomon's life is a paradox. He was the wisest king to ever live, yet his life ended in spiritual failure. His story is both an inspiration and a warning, a call to pursue wisdom, but also to remain steadfast in faith. It is a reminder that the pursuit of God must be our highest priority, for without him, even the greatest wisdom and success are empty. Solomon's legacy endures, but it is a legacy filled with lessons. His life calls us to reflect on our own priorities, to be vigilant in guarding our hearts, and to remember that true wisdom begins with the fear of the Lord. Only in him can we find lasting purpose, meaning, and fulfillment.